long before there were laboratories, prohibitions, and debates on social media. Human beings were already searching for something very clear: a bridge, a shortcut between the visible and the invisible. And in that search, a plant appeared, shrouded in mystery and controversy. Cannabis, for many ancient civilizations, was not something to relax with. It was medicine. It was a tool. It was a key capable of opening states of consciousness that, under normal conditions, remain locked with a double padlock. Today, modern culture has boxed it into the recreational: parties, laughter, disconnection. But there is a spiritual dimension to cannabis that almost no one knows about, and even fewer actually practice with real intention. So, the question is inevitable. What did the yogis and shaman priests see in this plant that made it a central part of their most sacred rituals? What wisdom was hidden among its leaves? From ancient India to the frozen steppes of Siberia, cannabis accompanied spiritual seekers who did not want to escape reality. They wanted to understand it. They used it as a vehicle toward the divine, as a tool to cross the limits of common perception and explore the self that normally remains silent. Do they agree with reality? It is not just any powerful tool, it demands intention. Without direction, it can open doors, but not necessarily the right ones. What could become a revealing experience can turn into mental noise, confusion, or simply chaos. That's why ancient cultures didn't improvise. They created rituals, preparations, rules, and precise contexts. They knew it wasn't about consuming, but about entering a sacred state with a clear purpose. In this journey, we are going to unearth that lesser-told history. We will explore how different cultures used cannabis as an instrument for transcendental connection, and above all, how that wisdom can help be applied today in a conscious way to truly transform your inner life. Throughout the centuries, many civilizations considered cannabis a sacred plant. It wasn't something casual, it wasn't improvised. Every ceremonial use was filled with intention and symbolism. In ancient India, for example, it was known as Vyaya, which means victory, victory, victory over what? For the sages of that time, cannabis symbolized the spiritual triumph over human suffering. It didn't just soothe the body, it aimed higher, to relieve the soul. In Hindu tradition, this plant is deeply linked to Shiva, the Lord of meditation, transformation, and transcendental change. It's not a minor detail. During festivals dedicated to Shiva, devotees consume a ceremonial drink called bhang, cannabis leaves mixed with milk, spices, and honey. But it's not just another drink, it's a conscious act of devotion, a ritual preparation designed to quiet the mind and dissolve, even if only for a moment, worldly concerns. Those who take part describe an expansion, a feeling that the veil between the everyday and the sacred becomes thinner.
Casi transparente.
As if for a few minutes they could catch a glimpse of something eternal. Further north, in Central Asia and Siberia, shamans adopted a different approach in their healing and spiritual connection rituals. They burned cannabis. The rising smoke was not seen as mere combustion, but as a subtle vehicle to other planes. As it rose to the sky, it symbolized a bridge, a channel through which prayers, messages, and energies could travel to the spirit world. For them, it was not entertainment, it was communication, it was guidance, it was balance between the visible and the invisible world. And the story doesn't end in Asia. In South America, different indigenous peoples also recognized the spiritual potential of cannabis, especially when entheogenic substances like ayahuasca were used in ceremonies. In all cases, the pattern repeats: intention, respect, and purpose. It wasn't the plant that performed the miracle, it was the consciousness with which it was used. In the Amazon, cannabis wasn't just a simple complement, it was an amplifier. It didn't just expand perception, it sharpened it, intensified visions, and deepened introspection. The ceremonial experience wouldn't just remain impressive, but would become transformative. The shamans understood something very specific. When combined with other master plants, cannabis increased emotional and spiritual sensitivity. And that sensitivity wasn't weakness, it was an open door. It allowed them to integrate the teachings received during the ceremony more clearly. It wasn't just about seeing things, but understanding them. In Jamaica, within the Rastafari culture, this plant acquired an explicit sacred dimension. It wasn't ambiguous, it wasn't half symbolic, it was the sacred herb. Inspired by biblical passages like Psalm 104.14, the Rastafarians consider its conscious use as an act of direct communion with God. It's not about evasion, it's about connection. For them, it's not smoke, it's sacred breath. It's a bond that elevates the mind and spirit to higher states of consciousness. A kind of spiritual elevator, but it only works if you know where you want to go up. And while all this was happening in ritual contexts, modern science began to look at what for centuries had been considered mystical. Today we know that cannabis contains cannabinoids like tetrahydrocannabinol and cannabidiol, which interact directly with the body's endocannabinoid system. A system that regulates emotions, perception of time, sensations, precisely the elements that are altered in deep spiritual experiences. In other words, what was previously explained with symbols now also has a biological correlation. The plant doesn't create spirituality. It activates mechanisms that modify conscious experience. It opens a physical channel to states that for centuries were interpreted only as religious or transcendental. But for ancient cultures, scientific validation wasn't necessary. They had direct experience. They knew that the states induced by the plant were real and meaningful, as long as they were used with clarity of intention. Because here's the other side. Without preparation, without respect, without purpose, what could be revelation turns into chaos. The same doors that can lead to understanding can open to confusion. That's why there were strict rituals, defined contexts, clear rules. It wasn't free consumption, it was a conscious encounter. From India to America, passing through Siberia and Jamaica, cannabis crossed cultures and eras as a spiritual vehicle. Different traditions, different symbols, but the same pattern. Reverence, intention, and purpose. For ancient civilizations, this plant not only connected with the divine, it also served to explore the hidden, to investigate reality beyond what the senses perceive. When used with clear intention, it allowed for the temporary suspension of the ordinary limitations of the mind, as if the mental noise turned down in volume and a deeper layer of consciousness appeared. Many describe that experience as if a veil were lifted for a few moments. What was always there but invisible becomes evident. The metaphor of the bridge is not an exaggeration. Cannabis worked as a link between two planes. The physical, tangible world limited by the senses, and a broader, multi-dimensional realm where perception expands. If we think about it in symbolic terms, it could be seen as a frequency tuner. It adjusts consciousness, synchronizing it with states where intuition becomes clearer, creativity flows more easily, and self-knowledge is more honest. That's why, in so many traditions, it was used to enhance meditation and deep contemplation. By momentarily reducing the incessant mental dialogue, that inner narrator that never stops talking. Attention can be focused more intensely on the present, The senses are amplified, perception becomes more vivid, and in some cases an unexpected clarity about the nature of the experience itself. Not because the plant teaches something new, but because for a moment it lets you hear what was always inside. In these expanded states, reality changes its texture. Colors are not only seen, they vibrate. Sounds are not only heard, they are felt. And the most ordinary things, breathing, walking, looking at the sky, become an unexpected revelation. One of the most striking effects of cannabis is how it alters our perception of time under its influence. Seconds stretch out, minutes become expansive, and sometimes time seems to stop altogether. And that feeling is not trivial. It's very similar to what advanced meditators and yogis describe, a state where the line of the past and the future fades, and only the present remains, a deep, intense, almost eternal present. When the linear perception of time breaks, something changes inside. Do you understand, even if just for moments, that the essence of life doesn't depend on the clock? That being is not chained to the succession of events, but to the awareness that observes them. Another key effect is the temporary reduction of the ego. That critical, constant, insistent voice lowers its volume, and when that happens, a different internal space appears, quieter, more spacious. In that space, the sense of separation weakens, and a perception of unity with what surrounds you arises, not as a philosophical concept, but as a direct experience. Many describe a deep connection with everything, nature, people, existence, and from there, states of humility, empathy, and compassion emerge that aren't forced, they simply appear. But this is where maturity is needed. Not everything perceived in these states is a transcendental revelation. Some experiences may be genuine intuitions, while others may be projections of the subconscious. Playing with complicated images and emotions without discernment, it's easy to confuse fantasy with wisdom. That's why many traditions insisted on the figure of a guide, someone with experience, capable of helping to distinguish between a deep perception and a momentary mental mirage. This point explains something fundamental. Cannabis is not a substitute for spiritual work. It's a catalyst. It can open the door.
Pero no camina por ti.
The most serious traditions always complemented it with discipline, constant meditation, prayer, and structured introspection. Because the elevated experience has no real value if it isn't integrated into daily life. A flash of clarity can be striking, but if it doesn't translate into concrete changes, it becomes just a nice memory, nothing more. The ancient masters understood clearly that the true power of cannabis on the spiritual path was not in the journey, but in the temporary awakening of consciousness. Those moments of expansion were only useful if they were later worked on, analyzed, and incorporated into real life. That's the difference between a transformative experience and a fleeting episode. When approached with respect and clarity, cannabis can become a powerful ally, not as an escape, but as an accelerator of self-knowledge. But for it to truly lead to a deep transformation, attitude is everything. It doesn't start at the moment of consumption, it starts much earlier. Ancient cultures understood something essential. Intention guides the experience. When interacting with the plant, they would precisely define the purpose: healing, understanding, inner exploration. Because without a clear purpose, the experience becomes scattered. With purpose, it is focused. That guides you, and in this field, the difference between dispersion and direction changes everything. Before using cannabis with spiritual intention, there's a question you can't skip. What for? What do you want to see? What do you need? What needs healing? What part of you is asking for attention? Without that clarity, the experience becomes scattered. With it, intention is guided. It works like an internal compass, setting direction and preventing the mind from getting lost in meaningless stimuli. This gesture, seemingly simple, changes everything that could be an automatic act. It becomes a ritual. For the ancient masters, cannabis was not a substance. It was a presence, something alive, sacred, and that respect was not symbolic or just for appearances. It was expressed in concrete actions, holding the plant with awareness, giving thanks, and saying a prayer before consuming it. Those gestures created a framework, a different mental and emotional field. They prepared the ground so that the experience would be deep, not superficial. But if you're still here halfway through, it means you don't want entertainment, you want expansion, and that already sets you apart. Leave me a clear sentence in the comments. Consciousness is not a game. I want to identify those who are not looking for a trip, but for a real transformation. The environment also matters a lot. Ancient traditions didn't improvise the space. They chose places with intention, open nature, or indoor spaces carefully prepared. Symbolic elements like candles, incense, crystals, or a small altar helped maintain a focused atmosphere. Not because the objects have automatic magic, but because the mind responds to the context. Silence or soft and mindful music makes it easier for attention to turn inward, and removing external distractions, like the phone or unnecessary noise. It's not a minor detail, it's a strategic decision. Some traditions even purified the space before the ritual, through meditation or energy practices, not out of superstition, but because they understood something basic. The external state influences the internal state, another key point that was repeated in almost every culture. Moderation means more is not better. High doses can cause overstimulation, and although at first it may seem like expansion, it can turn into anxiety, confusion, or disconnection from physical reality. Especially if the higher energy centers, the so-called chakras, are excessively altered without enough grounding. The key is not intensity, it's balance. Finding the minimum effective dose that opens perception without clouding mental clarity. That's the fine line. Real expansion happens when you can observe what arises without losing stability. And then comes the part that almost no one wants to do: integrate. Many experiences are intense but temporary. The value isn't in what you felt in the moment, but in what you do with it afterwards. That's why it's recommended to reflect after the ritual, to write down and note thoughts, emotions, and ideas that came up. Putting things into words turns the abstract into something applicable, and what's applicable is what transforms. Even post-ritual nutrition matters. Light and healthy foods help the body regain balance and make it easier to consciously return to an ordinary state. It's not a trivial detail, it's part of the integration process, and something fundamental. Cannabis should never become a crutch. It's not an escape, it's not anesthesia, it's not a permanent refuge. The spiritual purpose is not to escape reality, but to transform it from within. That means facing shadows, internal conflicts, uncomfortable emotions. Growing hurts sometimes, and no plant does that work for you. When used with respect, intention, and awareness, cannabis can become a powerful ally. It can reveal inner truths, expand perception, and offer clarity. But the real work begins when the experience ends. Throughout millennia, this plant has accompanied humanity in sacred contexts. From ceremonies in India to shamanic rituals in Siberia, from Rastafarian devotion in Jamaica to ancestral practices in South America, always with the same implicit message. It's not the act of consuming that matters. It's what you do with what you discover. Authentic spirituality is not built on isolated experiences. It is built by applying what you have learned day after day. In those states of expansion, enlightenment is not a single event. It is a process, a constant practice and coherence between what you experience and how you live. The ancient traditions understood this perfectly, which is why they insisted on balance, moderation, and clear intention. The goal was never to escape the world, but to understand it more deeply. Yes, it can offer extraordinary moments of connection, but they only become real wisdom when they are translated into concrete actions, into more compassion, greater honesty, and a more conscious relationship with yourself and others. That's where the experience stops being a journey and starts becoming evolution. And all of this only makes sense if it translates into a real commitment to your growth. We live in today's world. We live in a different era. The conscious use of cannabis is more open than ever. And that puts us in front of a historic opportunity to recover its sacred dimension. Without falling into the old mistakes of excess, escapism, or emotional dependence, we can look back, learn from the cultures that knew how to use this plant with respect and purpose, and combine their wisdom with current scientific knowledge. Not to romanticize it, not to demonize it, but to integrate it in a safer, more balanced, and transformative way. When tradition and modern understanding come together, the result can be a much more conscious practice. For those who are willing to explore with maturity, cannabis can become an ally in the awakening process. Not because it will do the work for you, but because it can help you see more clearly. It reminds us of something uncomfortable but fascinating. The boundary between the physical and the metaphysical is not as rigid as we think. The human experience is more malleable than we think. And when you understand that, you start to live differently, more connected, more present, more aware of the mystery that exists. Simpler. Now, if you decide to walk this ancestral path, do it with humility, with clarity, with a pure intention. The plant can show you doors, but no one can cross them for you. The responsibility is always yours, and so is the maturity. If you choose to move forward with wisdom, you will not only be honoring an ancient tradition, you will be taking concrete steps toward your own inner evolution. And then, cannabis stops being just a tool. It becomes a teacher, a mirror, a constant reminder that we are connected to something greater, a permanent invitation to look beyond the obvious and to discover the deep truths that have always been within you, waiting to be seen.